Okay, good morning. Chapter 9 is the chapter that deals with gender. And again, you have to recall that since Mumby operates predominantly from a critical perspective, looking at the notion of power, and power has a lot to do with distribution inequities. You know how certain constituents within an organization have power and others do not. Well, obviously one way that has been examined and explored is in the notion of gender. Obviously, traditionally, organizations have been the context for men. Women's entrance into that is relatively recent when you consider basically span of time. So looking at some of the issues within this chapter, we have obviously the chapter objectives, and probably the most significant is to understand the different perspectives that are mentioned here, and we'll see how this goes. So these are the three fundamental perspectives: this liberal, radical, and critical, and that is going to be the vast majority of the textbook. Each perspective has strengths and has weaknesses. They all are somewhat chronological in order in terms of the way they occurred in time. But if you look at them as a perspective, as a point of view, a way to examine gender within the workplace, that might help you to understand each perspective. They're literally a lens by which you look at gender. So first, liberal feminism. The emphasis on liberal feminism was all about creating a level playing field. It was about attempting to make women, quote unquote, equal with men, and that was in a variety of forms. One of the most fundamental aspects of liberal feminism, or fundamental early focuses of liberal feminism, was in the suffrage movement in terms of getting women the right to vote. There are several different waves of this, as you'll see, and the idea that the personal is political had a lot to do with this notion of opportunities in society, whether that was in the workplace or elsewhere, but the workplace emphasis is what we're focusing on here. So here they were looking at how do we expand opportunities, how do we attempt to have equity in pay, and how do we attempt to break through that notion of the glass ceiling and have women in upper management in places that have long been the realm of men predominantly. The issue of tokenism is discussed later on in this chapter, and many times the situation is you have a predominant sort of good old boys club kind of administration, but they're getting some flack for lack of women, and so they hire a woman, and she's just a token so that they can wave it around. Hey, look, we aren't sexist here. Look at her, and that's the idea of tokenism. So they put this token out in front a lot to get the attention, so that a lot of the inequities that exist in terms of gender are not predominant. Home and social reproduction. What that essentially has to do is simply the fact that we tend to like to be around people who are like us. Certainly the notion of opposites attract, what's called complementarity, does exist, but not nearly to the degree that similarity exists. We tend to draw toward us in relationships, both interpersonally and professionally, people with whom we have a similarity, something in common. And oftentimes in upper levels of management, it's based on gender. Okay, and this is more on that. Limitations. Certainly it didn't question the structure of organization. It was simply trying to work within the existing framework of organizations at the time, and how do we make women have advances? How do we help create that equity for them within the existing? So it didn't attempt to change organizational structures, simply attempted to increase women success in that environment. And gender was treated more as a variable, something that could be manipulated rather than this really exploring it for the notion of power. Radical feminism. This is your second perspective. So the first one was liberal, and now we're looking at radical. Radical feminism ultimately died out because you created a closed system, and but radical feminism attempted to do what liberal feminism did not, in that it attempted to completely reconfigure organizational structure from a feminist point of view. And that had a lot to do with things like eliminating hierarchy within an organization. It had to do with creating more of a collective, nurturing environment, that decisions were spread out over a large pool. And it definitely had some interesting things to it. Ultimately, it was not that successful, but we'll explore that. So the radical notion of radical feminism was this, that it was very focused on women. And like I said, it's an alternative way of thinking. So it rejected patriarchy, embraced matriarchy, and this collectivism I already mentioned. So here are some of the characteristics of an organization as it would be constituted or created within radical feminism. And you can just look at some of these characteristics and obviously see that they would be different than most organizations that exist today. Radical feminism would argue that those were very masculine in form and therefore not conducive to female employees. Here are your criticisms of it. It was very essentialist. So basically, it was very much focused only on women, to the point that the lack of inclusivity within radical feminism created a closed system. And obviously, as you know from what we've looked at so far in terms of systems, a closed system generally cannot sustain itself. So because it was very separatist, it ultimately died. And here you have the third perspective, which is critical feminism. And this one looks at it neither as a variable, something you can manipulate, or this, mere biological feature, but rather as a socially constructed variable. And therefore, as a socially constructed variable, we can alter it, we can adjust it, we can modify it. So basically realize that critical feminists argue that gender is less about a biological condition and more about how we socially have a set of expectations, how we create a set of expectations, how we create meaning. And so it was a very different perspective. This last one, notice this, focused on the ways that organizational members do gender. So it's very much more behavioral, understanding there are certain expectations, certain tasks within an organization that are considered traditionally masculine, certain tasks within an organization that are considered relatively feminine, and sometimes men have to do those tasks, sometimes or women have to do those tasks. How well do you do that? So again, it looked at these ideas of the accomplishes of both men and women, and argued that oftentimes we are prisoners of these expectations. Again, remember that gender is viewed as a socially constructed interpretation of meaning. So in terms of the comparison, the fact that your book offers these, I think, is a great way to sort of review and look at some of them. So you can see the differences in terms of the way they look at organizations, the way they look at gender, the way they look at communication, and emancipation, and that idea of resistance or separation. Okay, away from the three perspectives, exploring the notion of masculinity. So obviously this is a term very popular in the early 20th century, this idea of manliness, or what was expected of a male. And this term of hegemonic masculinity, this is how well you can exhibit certain characteristics within particular contexts or situations at work. So as you notice here, aggressiveness, strong heterosexuality, assertiveness, independence, and individuality. obviously clearly based on context in terms of what the situation was at work. If you were dealing with an employee in your office that was explaining why they needed to take a leave of absence due to a family tragedy, there are certain behaviors that you ought to exhibit that would be considered more feminine in nature. On the other hand, if you had an employee in your office that you needed to terminate and to fire, there are certain characteristics that are oftentimes determined or dictated or labeled as more masculine that would be more effective. So critical feminism would look at how well you do those behaviors, and this idea of masculinity focuses exclusively on those contexts, those tasks, those situations that tend to be a little bit more characterized by masculine qualities, what are stereotypically considered masculine qualities. And so here you have this idea of what that what that is, what makes that up, and you can take a look at that. And I think, is that one it? I think I have one more. No, that's the last slide. And so the most important thing to remember about this chapter on gender is that we're very much focused on power. We're very much looking at how individuals within the organizations behave in certain gendered ways, and how those affect the organization, both in the macro picture, sort of organizational structure, as well as the individual minute behaviors that exist within or required within certain tasks within the organization. So anyways, that's a little bit of an overview of chapter 10, and I'll get ready and we'll do the next chapter. This is chapter 9. We'll do chapter 10. Okay? Thanks.